the night it happened. I remember the hallway light spilling under my son's door like a thin blade, and the sound of his low, urgent voice drifting into the silence. My hands were still shaking from the cold air outside, but the chill that crept up my spine had nothing to do with the weather. In that moment, something in me broke, in a way that felt quiet, sharp, and irreversible. If you've ever trusted someone so deeply that a single moment could shatter your certainty, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. You're not alone in that feeling. I stood there frozen, listening to fragments that twisted into something dark in my mind, and I felt my entire world tilt under my feet. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything started to unravel. I never imagined my life could unravel in a single breath. But that is exactly what happened the moment I realized I might not be safe in my own family. 1 minute, I was still floating on the strange, quiet thrill of holding a winning lottery ticket, thinking about how a modest stroke of luck might finally give me room to breathe. The next minute, everything inside me went cold. I walked into that house expecting to surprise my son with good news. Instead, I stumbled into a moment that twisted my entire world out from under me. I did not hear full sentences. What reached me were fragments, tones, pieces, the kind of sharp, hushed urgency that sends a warning straight into your spine. Something about needing me gone. Something about money. Something that felt too deliberate, too heavy, too planned. I remember freezing in place, my hand still resting on the doorknob, my heartbeat rising until I could hear it in my ears. It felt like my chest tightened around a truth I was not ready to face. My first instinct was to tell myself I misunderstood, that I was tired or overly sensitive or letting stress play tricks on me. But the fear crept in anyway, slow and suffocating. My legs trembled, and a pressure built behind my ribs, as if my own body was telling me to run before my mind allowed the thought to form. By the time I stepped back outside, the warm excitement of the lottery win was gone. All that remained was a rising certainty that something was dangerously wrong, and that I needed to understand how my life had suddenly shifted from quiet hope to a threat I could not yet name. And that is where the real story begins. Long before I ever learned how far the misunderstanding would take me. My life had always been simple, shaped by modest routines and years of quiet sacrifice. Raising my son alone taught me to stretch every dollar and hold on to small joys. Most days began with coffee at the kitchen window, watching the neighborhood wake up slowly. Those peaceful mornings reminded me why I worked so hard to give him stability. He grew into a kind young man, thoughtful in ways that made me proud. Even after he moved out, I kept our bond close, always hoping he felt supported. My hopes were simple: steady health, enough savings, and the comfort of knowing he was safe. So, when I checked a forgotten lottery ticket one quiet afternoon, everything shifted unexpectedly. The numbers lined up, and a rush of disbelief washed over me before excitement bloomed. My first instinct was to share the moment with him, imagining his smile and warm encouragement. But the air changed the moment I stepped inside, catching tones that felt strangely urgent. I paused, unsure why my heartbeat stuttered as fragments reached me from deeper in the house. Something about money, something tense, something that made my stomach clench without explanation. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, yet a faint tremor curled through my hands. The warmth I carried in faded, replaced by an unease I couldn't name or push aside. By the time I stepped back outside, the excitement of the win had dissolved into rising dread. I felt a faint shaking in my breath, as if my own intuition was warning me to be careful that day. The moment those fragmented sounds reached me again, my entire body stiffened before I could even think. There was a sharp edge in the tone, something cold underneath it that made my stomach tighten. I remember standing completely still, listening to pieces that didn't form sentences, but carried unmistakable intent. It felt as if a curtain dropped in front of my life, revealing a version of my son I never imagined. My breath shortened, trembling in my chest, and a heat rose behind my eyes as denial fought reality. I kept telling myself I misheard, yet the fragments pressed into me with a weight I couldn't shake. It was the kind of fear that climbs slowly, then suddenly floods every corner of your mind at once. I felt something inside me break, a realization that trust could shatter without warning and leave only panic behind. My hands began to tremble, and I backed away as quietly as possible, terrified they would notice me there. Every instinct urged me to run, to get out before I became part of whatever dangerous plan those pieces suggested. By the time I reached the doorway, fear had fully taken hold, leaving me shaking with disbelief and heartbreak. I stepped outside, breath unsteady, knowing I couldn't confront him and couldn't stay another second in that house. I felt danger closing in fast. That was the moment I knew I had to disappear, if only long enough to figure out what danger I was truly facing. The walk back to my car felt unreal, like my body was moving ahead of my mind. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment, gripping it with both hands while my heartbeat refused to settle. The fear still surged through me, but once the initial shock eased, a different instinct began to rise, a need to think clearly before panic swallowed me whole. I forced myself to breathe and lay out what I actually knew. I had overheard tones laced with urgency, fragments tied to money, and a sense of something planned. I had no proof, only implications. But implications were enough when your safety suddenly felt uncertain. My background as a bookkeeper has always pushed me toward lists, toward structure, toward breaking chaos into manageable pieces. So I mentally sorted everything: what I heard, what I feared, what I couldn't yet understand, and what steps might keep me alive long enough to figure it out. When I thought about who I could trust, the list was painfully short. Most of my life I handled things alone, and while my son had always been my anchor, I could no longer lean on that certainty. The only person who came to mind was my cousin Erin in Wisconsin. Steady, private, and far from anyone who might be watching me. I called her under the most ordinary excuse I could think of, masking the tremble in my voice, and she invited me without suspicion. That call gave me my first moment of calm. By the time I hung up, the outline of a plan had begun to take shape. Frightening, but necessary. If I disappeared for a while, maybe even staged something that looked accidental, I could buy enough time to understand what danger I was truly in. That was the moment fear shifted into determination, and the path toward my next move became unavoidable. The drive to Erin's cabin in Wisconsin felt endless, every mile stretching with the weight of what I was about to do. When I finally pulled into the gravel driveway, the quiet hit me first. The lake sat still under a gray sky, and for a moment I let myself breathe, trying to gather the pieces of who I was before fear rewrote everything. But the calm didn't last long. I knew why I was there, and I knew I had to act before doubt dragged me backward. I spent that first evening laying out my plan the same way I used to organize accounts at work, step by step, detail by detail. I researched boating accidents, studying how debris floated, how engines failed, how investigators determined what happened. I rented a small aluminum boat from a local shop, keeping my voice steady as I filled out the paperwork. Back at the cabin, I sorted items I could leave behind to make the scene believable: a jacket, a water bottle, a book I always kept in my bag. Each object felt like a piece of my old life placed gently on the edge of an ending. The next morning, I walked the shoreline, taking in every bend of the lake. I chose a narrow cove tucked between two rock outcrops, isolated enough that no one would see me, but open enough for debris to drift. As I loaded the boat, a heaviness settled in my chest. I kept thinking about my son, about the softness in his voice when he was younger, about all the years I believed our bond was unbreakable. The ache of that betrayal, real or imagined, pushed me forward. When night fell, I set the small charge I'd rigged from basic supplies, just enough to split the hull and send fragments across the water. I placed my belongings where they'd be found and lowered myself onto a second inflatable raft tied to the stern. Then I lit the fuse. The pop echoed across the lake, sharp and final. I slipped into the darkness, drifting away from the flames, from the life I had known, and from the person I had been until that moment. Ahead of me waited a new name, a new city, and a truth I wasn't ready to face, but knew I had to find. Milwaukee felt like another planet the night I arrived, carrying only a backpack and the weight of the life I had just blown apart. I checked into a small month-to-month rental under the new name I'd stitched together, and for the first time since leaving the lake, I was alone with nothing but silence. It didn't bring comfort. It brought reality. I turned on the local news, and there it was. Footage of the search on the water, interviews with neighbors, reporters speculating about an accident. Seeing my own name listed as missing, likely deceased, shook something loose inside me. It was surreal, watching the world react to a version of my death while I sat breathing on a stranger's couch. What broke me was hearing my son's voice on the screen. He sounded shattered, pleading for updates, begging anyone with information to come forward. I could hear panic in every word, as if he had lost the last solid part of his life. I tried to brush it off, but doubt crept in. If he wanted me gone, why did he sound destroyed? The question kept circling my mind until it pushed me to dig deeper. I accessed public records, old messages, anything I could find. His expenses didn't make sense for months. Large withdrawals, unusual charges, a pressure that looked more like desperation than greed. I looked up the name I thought I heard that day in his house, expecting nothing. Instead, I found threads tied to a small extortion ring operating in the region. Lawsuits, arrest records, patterns of targeting vulnerable people. A new fear formed, one that replaced my son as the threat and placed him squarely in the role of someone trapped. As the pieces rearranged themselves, the truth became something I couldn't solve alone. I needed help, under my new identity. I reached out to the police, requesting a private meeting. I didn't know exactly what waited for me there, but I knew it was time to face it. Walking into the police station under a name that wasn't mine felt like stepping into a version of my life I barely recognized. I sat in a small interview room, palms damp, heart unsteady, waiting for detectives who had no idea the woman they were about to meet was supposed to be dead. When they entered, I handed over everything I had gathered: records, notes, late-night observations born from fear and guilt. I told them I believed my son might be connected to something dangerous, though I still braced myself for blame to fall on him. The detectives listened quietly, exchanging looks that made my stomach twist. Then they began to speak, not in accusations, but in pieces of a much larger investigation. They showed me reports I hadn't known existed: complaints, financial trails, intercepted messages tied to the extortion ring I had stumbled upon. As they laid out the timeline, a weight settled over me. My son hadn't been plotting anything against me. He had been cornered, threatened, and trying to shield me while drowning in fear of what these people could do. My mind reeled as they played fragments of recorded phone calls, his voice tight with desperation, fighting to keep both of us safe. The guilt hit me with full force. I felt myself crumble inward, realizing how quickly I had assumed the worst of the person who had always tried to protect me. I told them I was alive. The words tasted heavy, soaked in regret. The detectives exchanged another look, concerned, cautious, aware of the legal chaos this revelation might create. But none of that mattered to me. I needed to see him. I insisted, steadying my voice, that I wouldn't leave without speaking to my son. After a long moment, they agreed to arrange a private meeting. As they led me down a quiet hallway toward the visitation room, my heart pounded with a mix of dread and hope, knowing the next few minutes would change everything between us. When they opened the door to the visitation room, the air felt heavy enough to press against my ribs. I stepped inside slowly, bracing myself, but nothing could have prepared me for the sight of my son sitting at that metal table. His shoulders were slumped in a way I had never seen before, as if the week had aged him years. His eyes were swollen, skin pale, and I could tell he had barely slept. The moment he looked up and truly saw me, alive, his entire face crumpled, his breath caught, and I watched the mix of shock, grief, and relief collide inside him. As I sat across from him, I could feel the storm rising in him, a week's worth of fear and guilt pushing against whatever composure he had left. He poured out everything: how the threats against me started, how he tried to shield me, how he felt trapped between danger and helplessness. He talked about all the ways he believed he had failed me, how every choice only seemed to make things worse, how he had convinced himself he wasn't strong enough to protect the one person who had always protected him. Listening to him broke something open inside me. When it was my turn, I told him the truth, every trembling piece of it: how I panicked, how I misread that moment in his house, how terror took over and logic fell away, how I staged my death because I thought it was the only way to survive. Saying it out loud felt like peeling back layers of shame I didn't realize had grown so deep. We both realized then how fear had twisted everything. It hadn't been a lack of love, but an excess of it. Love so fierce, it made both of us desperate and blind in different ways. When the weight finally spilled out between us, there was a release so raw, it left us both silent, just breathing in the truth. By the time we stood to leave, there was something steadier between us. Fragile, but real. We agreed, without even needing to say it, that we would face what came next together. Whatever this criminal ring had built around him, around us, it was time to break it apart. And with that shared resolve, we stepped toward whatever justice waited in the next chapter. When the detectives brought me into the briefing room the next morning, I felt a steadiness I hadn't known in weeks. My son sat across from me, no longer haunted by the same panic that once clung to him. Together, under the protection of my new identity, we laid out every detail we had: names, patterns, transactions, the strange behaviors I had noticed without understanding. Federal agents took over from there, moving with a quiet confidence that made me believe justice might finally be possible. The sting operation unfolded over the next several days. I wasn't present for the arrests, but I remember the moment they told us it was done. The ring was dismantled, the leaders in custody, their network exposed. It felt like a weight I had carried without knowing had finally loosened its grip. My son's legal situation shifted almost instantly. Evidence showed he had been a victim, not an accomplice. Watching the charges fall away was like seeing him breathe for the first time in months. Revealing I was alive to the world was another kind of shockwave. Some people cried, some scolded me gently, others just stared as if unsure whether to hug me or shake me. But slowly, the community welcomed me back. I felt myself settling into the truth instead of hiding from it. My son and I rebuilt our rhythm one quiet conversation at a time, both of us learning how fear had shaped our choices and how trust needed to be tended carefully, like something fragile but worth protecting. One afternoon, as we stood outside the house that once echoed with so much confusion, I planted a small dogwood tree by the front walkway. Watching its thin branches reach toward the light felt like the simplest, clearest symbol of a new beginning. And with that sense of renewal, I felt myself ready for the final chapter ahead. Looking back on everything that happened, I still feel a quiet tremor run through me. Fear can twist the world into shapes that barely resemble the truth. And for a while, I let that twisted version guide my every step. I thought I was saving myself, when really I was running from shadows I never stopped long enough to understand. But walking through all of it with my son, through the justice, the healing, the hard conversations, showed me how easily love can be tangled with fear, and how important it is to pause before letting panic write the story. I've watched my son rise from something that could have broken him. His resilience, his honesty, and his heart remind me every day that people are more complicated, more courageous than our worst fears allow us to believe. And as for me, I'm learning to forgive myself for the choices I made when I thought I had none. Life rarely gives second chances, but somehow I was handed one. And I'm grateful in a way that settles deep inside my chest. If you've ever lived through fear that made you question the people you love, or if you've ever found your way back from a misunderstanding that nearly cost you everything, I hope this story reminds you that healing is possible, that conversation is worth more than silence, that love, even when shaken, can still find its footing. If this journey resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experiences, your reflections, or the moments that stayed with you. Your voice matters here.